Rolling over the streets of Boston are sausage-shaped steam trains that carry passengers in sunlit, luxurious cabins. They can go around any corner and they can climb up any hill. And best of all, it's cheaper to build than any other train. This is the vision of possibly one of America's best and most misunderstood inventors. Someone who wanted to revolutionize the Revolutionary War and wanted to overhaul the face of US transportation. This is the incredible steampunk monorail, the Meigs Elevated Rail. Now, you're probably looking at this and thinking, Nick, this is a monorail. Well, I'm sorry, I've lied to you. It's not a monorail technically, but actually a 3-rail system. There were 2 lower rails that bared the load of the train that angled inwards, and a 3rd rail in the middle that the main locomotive would use to grip onto, allowing the train to go around any bends and up and down any hills. But it's inside the passenger car where the luxury was quite apparent. The passenger wagon was 3.26 meters, or about 10 feet wide at the middle, and featured a large glass window letting in plenty of light. With a long continuous padded seat along each side, and a row of swiveling barbershop chairs in the middle, there was plenty of seating for all of the passengers, roughly 72 per car. And if you're looking at this and wondering about the standing room, well, that wasn't part of the design. There was literally nothing for them to hold on to. There were open platforms at each carriage to allow entry and exit when it arrived at the station, and apparently there was no heating, so you can imagine that in winter this train would become very cold indeed. Maybe something like out of that Snowpiercer movie. The locomotive at the front was similar in its shape, but it had a turret at the front that would have the engineer's cap with a 360-degree view along the train to allow it to run in reverse, removing the need for a turntable at each end of the line. The steam engine would be located here as well, and this would power the gripper wheels, which would move the train along the track using that 3rd track in the middle. There would also be a fireman by the boiler who would feed the engine with coal from the tender that would be behind the locomotive. But what's not clear to me is exactly how the fireman got the coal from the tender to the boiler without dropping it onto passerbys below. But I need to reiterate before we get further in the video that this was a steam locomotive and not electric, and that will come back in a big way later. But this idea was much more than just a passenger transport concept for the inner city of America. It was the dream of one man who saw the future, and he actually built a prototype for the people to ride on in Boston. Found and Explained fans, meet Josiah Vincent Meigs. The Boston City Council forbid any construction within the city limits until the idea was actually tested in real life. They demanded at least 1 mile of rail to be built and operated, and that the strength of the structure and passenger cabin be tested, with the locomotive's power to be examined by a board of railway commissioners. And that's what they got to work doing. Choosing the site of an all-glass factory, the company raised $500,000 in additional funds and built a short section of the elevated rail. The test track would actually be built out of wood throughout the yard, but then when it would rise over the local road, it would switch to iron, about 4 meters in height above the passerbys, curving to prove that the train could go around bends. Now, this is where we start to bring out the dodgy tinfoil. The construction was done by a second company, also founded by Meigs, called the Meigs Elevated Railway Construction Company, which was intended to win all the contracts for the construction of future lines. So talk about double dipping. The experiment was opened and passengers were invited to come and try it out, causing quite the stir in Boston. Meigs would further promote the concept, issuing separate pamphlets, including one that's a 200-page book that this video is based on in 1887. Other cities picked up on the idea, such as Paris and Chicago, the latter who seriously considered this design for their elevated rail. If you're watching this from Chicago, I'd love you to write a comment down below if you could imagine seeing this steam trains going above your city streets. The core principle behind this idea, and why Meigs thought it was so superior to those high and mighty railway barons trains, was that it was designed to make the street-level footprint of the line as narrow as possible. He pointed out in his book that other railway designs impeded traffic or blocked out the sky, and his monorail concept, again sorry for mislabeling it, was superior for the streets of America. And plus, because this was elevated, it meant there wouldn't have to be any expensive tunneling, you wouldn't have to worry about building crossings for traffic on the roads below, and with the high snowfall that sometimes happened around the Boston area, this train would be immune to any sort of closures due to these natural elements, making this really quite the perfect solution for this area. Now, I do also want to point out some things that just look like magic and weren't really covered in the book. The track design was rather confusing. To switch tracks, a junction system was envisioned that would have a single swinging section rotating from one of the pillars on a giant hinge. I don't really know how that would be moved or how it would work, because you would have to have an actual operator who would pull a lever. And because there was no power supply provided, it may have to require actual manual labor or, say, an animal to pull it across. And then also in terms of maintenance of the track, there would have to be ground crews who would slowly move along the street below with scaffolding to examine the track as the trains rushed overhead. These are all complicated little details that Meigs wasn't bothered by until he would win that contract. You know, trust him. So what happened? Why did we never get this incredible steampunk monorail? By 1988, there was a change in Boston. Electricity had arrived for the masses. The first electric streetcar opened up in the city, and this was a herald of changing times. Meigs, who was so confident in his design that it was going forward, actually dismantled the demonstrator and was standing around waiting for approval to build his Boston to Cambridge line. Actually, side note here, there was also a fire at the demonstration facility which suspiciously destroyed one of the prototypes, which Meigs would actually ask for insurance money. Now, I'm not trying to put more tinfoil on your head, but the fact that he got back a lot of his investment in form of the insurance payout during this time when it was very clear that his project was starting to stall is kind of telling indeed. Investors wanted to partner with Meigs, and they wanted to use his design. However, they did have one change. They wanted to use the newfangled electricity. And Meigs, seemingly channeling the character of Rourke from The Fountainhead, didn't want to trust this magical power and insisted that steam was the future of all rail transportation. This alienated the investors and made them distrustful of his design, resulting in another, more traditional elevated railway design to be chosen for the project that used electricity. And that would be the end of Meigs' concept being seriously considered, with the original line opening without the visionary in 1901. And looking back on the concept, you can see that he was almost there. Now, I'm no engineer, but the track design and concept seems quite ingenious. I love that it has the ability to go up and down without any problem, go around bends and curves, and I love the actual design of the railway carriages. It's crazy to think that there was a modern design from looking like the 1950s back in 1880. That's really quite crazy. And knowing now how elevated railway design would change the face of cities like Chicago and New York, I do pine for this sort of concept like the monorail, which would allow so much more sunlight to the streets below. Now, this is me just talking here, Nick from Found and Explained, and not actually the narrator, so I want to give my own personal opinion and say, if I was to make some changes to make this work, well, for one, I would have the passenger cabins have room for standing passengers, maybe something hanging down that they could hold on to, or have forward-facing seats to increase that cabin capacity. I do love the open airiness of the cabin, so I wouldn't change that, but we need to think about it in actual practical usage terms. And if we're overhauling the interiors of these trains, I would make sure there was heating as well, because those Boston winters can be quite cold. And naturally, I would also include an electric third rail, because electricity was the future of this type of rail transportation in not only America, but the world. And this design would have worked really well with electric trains. I don't know why Meigs was so against it, but imagine if he had just been a little bit more flexible, like his trains, and it might have changed the landscape of US public transportation forever.